Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. Picture yourself completely and utterly trapped. Not stuck in traffic or cornered in an awkward conversation, but trapped in a way that rewires your understanding of the word. You're standing on a sheet of ice, a floating island in a frozen ocean that stretches 1,000,000 square miles in every direction. The cold doesn't just bite, it punches you in the chest with every breath. Your ship, the only thread connecting you to civilization, is gone, crushed by the ice like a toy. You watched it disappear beneath the surface, leaving you and 27 other souls completely, terrifyingly alone. No radio, no rescue beacon. No one on Earth knows where you are, or that you're fighting for your life. The year is 1915. Helicopters don't exist. Planes can't reach you. The nearest human beings are over 1,000 miles away, across an ocean so violent it's earned a reputation as the deadliest stretch of water on the planet. So what would you do? When every logical bone in your body screams that you're finished, where do you find the will to take even one more breath? This isn't a thought experiment. This is the true story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance. It is, without a hint of exaggeration, the most extraordinary survival story ever documented. The book we're diving into today, Endurance by Alfred Lansing, goes beyond simple historical reporting. It's a masterwork of storytelling, woven together from the private diaries of the men who actually lived through this nightmare. Lansing spent years hunting down survivors and their journals, some stained with seal blubber and warped from seawater, to recreate a story so vivid and immediate that you'll feel the wind cutting through your clothes and the gnaw of hunger in your belly. This tale has become legendary, dissected in business schools and military academies worldwide, but at its core, it's an achingly human story about hope clinging to life by its fingernails, about despair that threatens to swallow you whole, and about a leader who simply refused to accept defeat. By the time we finish this journey together, you won't just know what these men survived. You'll understand what it truly means to lead when the situation is hopeless, and all you have left is the trust of the people standing beside you. This story will lodge itself in your soul, becoming your personal yardstick for measuring courage. So let's start. Let's travel back to the golden age of exploration, to a dream of crossing the last blank spot on the map, and to a ship named Endurance. Our tale doesn't begin in the ice. It starts in the restless heart of a man named Sir Ernest Shackleton. By 1914, Shackleton was already famous in exploration circles. He'd gotten within 97 miles of the South Pole, closer than any human before him, but had been forced to turn back. Someone else, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, had planted his flag at the pole. The North Pole had fallen too. For a man like Shackleton, a romantic, a daredevil, a throwback to the age of adventure, only one great polar journey remained: crossing the entire Antarctic continent from one side to the other, straight over the pole. The ambition was breathtaking. He called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan was elegant in its boldness. He would sail the Endurance into the treacherous Weddell Sea, land with a small party, and march 1,800 miles across the frozen continent to the Ross Sea, where a second ship would be waiting after laying supply caches along the final leg. Shackleton possessed an almost supernatural ability to persuade people. His confidence was infectious, his charm irresistible. He secured funding from wealthy patrons, and when word got out about his plans, over 5,000 people applied to join him. His selection process was, let's say, unconventional. He cared less about credentials than character. He hired one scientist after asking if he could carry a tune. He chose a meteorologist simply because he, quote, looked funny. What Shackleton understood instinctively was that he wasn't just assembling a crew of experts. He was building a band of brothers who could withstand the crushing psychological weight of the Antarctic. His right-hand man was Frank Wild, a compact, tough-as-leather veteran who had nearly reached the pole with Shackleton before. Wild was the steady rudder to Shackleton's sometimes stormy captaincy. The ship's captain was Frank Worsley, a brilliant New Zealand navigator who claimed he'd found the expedition office in a dream. And then there was the ship herself, the Endurance. She was a masterpiece of engineering, possibly the strongest wooden vessel ever constructed. Built in Norway by craftsmen who knew the polar seas intimately, her hull combined oak and Norwegian fir, over 2.5 feet thick in places. Her bow, designed to ram through ice, was a solid 4 feet of oak. The shipbuilders loved her like a daughter, knowing she might be the last of her kind. Shackleton renamed her Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." The name would prove darkly prophetic. In August 1914, as Europe plunged into the First World War, the Endurance sailed from England. Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the war effort, but received a one-word telegram from the Admiralty, signed by Winston Churchill, "Proceed." The world was turning toward war, but the age of heroic exploration was having one final, glorious moment. After a last stop at South Georgia, a remote whaling outpost where weathered Norwegian whalers warned him the ice conditions were the worst in living memory, Shackleton, ever the optimist, decided to push forward. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance weighed anchor and pointed south toward Antarctica. For weeks, the Endurance battled through pack ice. It was a world of terrible beauty. The ship twisted and wriggled through narrow channels of open water, dodging massive icebergs that towered like floating mountains. The sounds were otherworldly, the groaning and squealing of ice floes, a constant grinding pressure. Progress was agonizingly slow. By Christmas, they were still far from their landing site. The Antarctic summer is brief, and time was slipping away. In mid-January 1915, less than a day's sail from their destination, they encountered a different beast. It was a thick, slushy soup of pulverized ice and soft snow. It closed around the ship like setting concrete. Worsley wrote in his log, "We therefore lie to for a while to see if the pack opens." It never did. A sudden, unseasonable gale from the north compressed the entire Weddell Sea pack against the continent, and then a sharp temperature drop froze it solid. The Endurance was caught, as one crew member put it, frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. Initially, hope survived. They were only 60 miles from land. They kept steam in the boilers, ready to push through at the first sign of an opening. Days became weeks. They made desperate attempts to free her, with everyone on the ice wielding saws and picks to cut a channel. They'd work for hours only to watch the ice freeze over again behind them. Slowly, the awful truth settled over them. They weren't getting out. They were trapped, doomed to spend the winter drifting with the ice pack, wherever the ocean's whims might take them. Shackleton, always pragmatic, ordered the sea watches canceled. He made it official. They would turn the ship into a winter station. To combat the soul-crushing monotony of the endless polar night, Shackleton established strict routines. The dogs were moved onto the ice into kennels they dubbed dogloos. The scientists continued their work, dredging the seafloor and recording weather patterns. But Shackleton's main focus was always morale. He knew that boredom and hopelessness were enemies as deadly as the cold. They organized hockey matches on the ice. They held dog sled races, the Antarctic Derby, complete with fierce rivalries. On Midwinter's Day, the darkest day of the year, they threw a raucous party in their cramped quarters below deck, which they'd christened the Ritz. Men dressed in ridiculous costumes, belted out songs, and performed comedy sketches. Shackleton grasped a fundamental truth of leadership. When you can't offer progress, you must create purpose and distraction. He kept his men occupied, their minds engaged, their spirits as high as humanly possible. All the while, the ice pack was carrying them on its own mysterious voyage. They were drifting, not toward their goal, but away from it, carried northwest in a great, slow spiral by the Weddell Sea's currents. They were a microscopic speck of life in a vast, frozen graveyard. Then, in late July, as the first hints of returning sunlight appeared on the horizon, the real danger began. The pack ice, which had been relatively stable, started to move. The sounds of pressure returned, a deep, ominous groaning that carried an unmistakable threat. Their protective floe cracked. The ship was no longer in a safe harbor. She was in a battle zone. On August 1st, the pressure hit with devastating force. The ship shuddered, lurched upward, then tilted violently. The massive floe that had protected her for months had shattered and was now attacking her. For weeks, the Endurance fought for survival. The men could hear her timbers groaning, screaming as the pressure mounted. Beams and frames, many a foot thick, snapped with sounds like cannon fire. One of the doctors, Alexander Macklin, wrote that the ship behaved like a living creature in its death throes. They lived with this terrifying symphony for months. The pressure would come in waves. Sometimes the ship would merely shiver. Other times she would convulse in violent spasms, her three masts whipping back and forth. The men worked endlessly at the pumps as the ice tore open her hull, but the incoming water was a battle they couldn't win. On October 27, 1915, after 3 days of non-stop, futile fighting, Shackleton accepted the inevitable. At 5 p.m., he gave the order to abandon ship. There was no panic. They were simply too exhausted for theatrics. They were beaten. Frank Wilde went to the crew's quarters where 2 sailors lay collapsed in their bunks. "She's going, boys," he said quietly. "I think it's time to get off." They transferred essential supplies, sledges, dogs, and 3 small lifeboats onto the ice. They established camp on a large, seemingly stable floe a short distance away. As they worked, 10 emperor penguins waddled up to the dying ship, raised their heads, and released a series of eerie, mournful cries. One old sailor turned to his companion. "Do you hear that?" he said. "Will none of us get back to our homes again?" That night, from their tents on the ice, they watched their ship. She was a twisted wreck, her stern thrust 20 feet into the air. She floated only because the ice that was destroying her still held her up. Sir Ernest Shackleton now carried a responsibility few humans have ever known. He had 27 men with him, castaways in the heart of Antarctica. Their position was 69 degrees south latitude. They were 1,200 miles from the nearest outpost of civilization. They were utterly alone. If rescue was coming, they would have to rescue themselves. Their new home was the ice itself. They called their first camp Ocean Camp. The initial plan was to march across the ice, dragging 2 lifeboats, toward Paulet Island, 346 miles northwest. There, supplies from a previous expedition had been left more than a decade earlier. The march began on October 30th. It was murderous work. The ice surface was a chaotic nightmare of pressure ridges, some as tall as houses, and deep, soft snow. The boats, weighing over a ton each, had to be dragged by teams of men harnessed like draft animals. After 2 days of superhuman effort, They'd covered less than 2 miles in a straight line from the wreck. Shackleton made a painful decision. The effort wasn't worth the progress. They would stop, establish a more permanent camp on the most stable floe they could find, and wait. They would trust the ice drift to carry them closer to land. They named this new home Patience Camp. For weeks, they returned to the Endurance wreck, still visible, to salvage what they could. They cut through the submerged decks to rescue cases of flour, sugar, and other provisions. They knew their survival depended on it. But on November 21st, as they watched from camp, the stern of the Endurance rose one final time into the air. Then, slowly and silently, she slipped beneath the ice and vanished. Shackleton wrote in his diary that night, "I cannot write about it." Their life on the ice became a strange, primitive existence. They hunted seals and penguins for food and blubber to fuel their small stove. Days were marked by gnawing hunger and the inescapable cold and dampness. Their reindeer skin sleeping bags were perpetually soaked. Their clothes, which they never removed, became stiff with frozen sweat and grime. Shackleton's focus, as always, remained on his men. He understood that their greatest threat wasn't the cold or hunger but despair. He kept them busy, but he also watched them closely, managing egos and potential conflicts. He moved the ship's carpenter, the perpetually cantankerous Chippy McNeish, into Frank Wild's tent, instructing Wild to keep him in line. He took the more difficult personalities into his own tent. As weeks dragged into months, their drift was agonizingly slow and carrying them slightly east, away from land. The food situation became critical. To conserve their dwindling supplies, Shackleton made one of the expedition's hardest decisions. The dogs, which consumed precious seal meat, had to be put down. For the men who'd raised and trained them, it was heartbreaking. Frank Wild, the second in command, carried out the grim task. He led each team of dogs away from camp, sat them in the snow, and shot them one by one. That day, they ate dog meat. It was, one man wrote, exquisitely tender and flavorful. By early April 1916, after 5.5 months drifting on the ice, their situation had become desperate. Their floe was disintegrating. They were living on a piece of ice, now less than 100 yards across, battered by ocean swells. They could feel the rise and fall of open water beneath them. On April 9th, the ice opened just enough. There was no time to hesitate. "Strike the tents and clear the boats," Shackleton roared. Within an hour, they were in 3 small boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, rowing for their lives through a churning maze of ice. For the first time in 497 days, they were off the ice and at the mercy of the open sea. Their journey to Elephant Island, their nearest hope for solid ground, was a 7-day nightmare. They were constantly soaked, their clothes frozen solid. Thirst became more agonizing than hunger, as they had no fresh water. Their lips swelled and cracked. Their tongues became so swollen they could barely speak. They chewed raw seal meat to swallow a few drops of blood. The nights were worst. They would lash the boats together and ride out the freezing darkness, while waves battered them relentlessly. One night, their floe split right beneath a tent. One of the stokers, Ernie Holness, plunged into the freezing water in his sleeping bag. Shackleton, with one tremendous heave, yanked him out just as the two halves of the floe crashed back together. They were stalked by killer whales, who would surface terrifyingly close to the small boats, their fins slicing through the water. The men were pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. Some wept from pain and cold. Several suffered severe frostbite. The young stowaway, Percy Blackborough, lost all feeling in his feet. Finally, on the morning of the 7th day, through the mist, they spotted it. The black, towering cliffs of Elephant Island. They had made it. They had reached land. But their ordeal was far from finished. Elephant Island was a desolate, inhospitable fortress of rock and ice, hammered by the ferocious winds of the Drake Passage. It offered sanctuary but was far from any shipping route. No one would ever find them there by accident. Rescue wouldn't come to them, they had to go get it. Shackleton knew what had to be done. He announced his plan. He would take the most seaworthy boat, the 22-foot James Caird, and with 5 men, attempt to sail 800 miles across the most violent stretch of ocean on Earth to the whaling stations on South Georgia. It was a journey that seemed not just improbable, but insane. He chose his crew carefully. Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator, was essential. Tom Crean, the tough-as-nails Irishman. 2 strong seamen, John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy. And finally, Chippy McNeish, the carpenter. McNeish was older and not in the best shape, but Shackleton needed his skills to make the boat seaworthy, and frankly, he worried McNeish's grumpy nature would cause problems if left behind. McNeish set to work, using scraps of wood and canvas to build a makeshift deck over the open boat to give them a fighting chance against the monstrous waves of the Drake Passage. On April 24, 1916, after placing the remaining 22 men under Frank Wild's command, Shackleton and his 5 companions launched the James Caird into the raging sea. As they sailed away, the men left behind gave them 3 cheers, their voices swallowed by the howling wind. The 16-day voyage of the James Caird stands alone in maritime history. The 6 men were crammed into a space so small they could barely move. They were constantly miserably wet. The temperature often dropped below freezing, and spray breaking over the boat froze into a thick casing of ice, weighing her down dangerously. They had to crawl onto the treacherous, icy deck to chip it off with an axe. Their sleeping bags, soaked with salt water, began to rot. Their skin, chafed raw from perpetually wet clothes, was covered in salt water boils. Thirst was constant torment. Their fresh water became contaminated with seawater, making it nearly undrinkable. But their greatest enemy was the sea itself. They were sailing through the screaming 50s, home of the legendary Cape Horn rollers waves, estimated at up to 90 feet high. The little boat would be lifted to the crest of a monstrous wave, then plunge into the trough, with the horizon disappearing completely. One night, during hurricane-force winds, Shackleton was at the tiller. He saw what he thought was a break in the clouds on the horizon. A moment later, he realized his mistake. It wasn't sky. It was the white crest of the biggest wave he'd ever seen in his life. "For God's sake, hold on!" he screamed. "It's got us!" The wave broke over them, hurling the boat forward like a cork. They were swamped, half filled with water, but somehow, miraculously, stayed afloat. They bailed frantically and survived. Worsley's navigation was nothing short of genius. In a wildly pitching, open boat, soaked and freezing, he would wait for momentary glimpses of sun through storm clouds to take readings with his sextant. Their lives depended on his calculations. If he was off by even a single degree, they would miss South Georgia and sail into the empty Atlantic to certain death. On the 15th day, they saw seaweed and seabirds, signs of land. At last, through the fog, they spotted the black, frowning cliffs of South Georgia. They had done it. They had crossed 800 miles of the world's worst ocean in a 22-foot boat. but the island refused to surrender easily. Hurricane-force winds were driving them toward a coast of sheer cliffs and uncharted reefs. The sound of breakers was deafening. To attempt landing would be suicide. For another 24 hours they fought for their lives, battling the storm, trying to hold position off the coast, knowing one mistake would smash them on the rocks. They were so close yet so impossibly far. This final test seemed the cruelest of all. Finally, after 16 days at sea, exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of complete collapse, they found a small, sheltered cove and steered the Kayard through a narrow gap in the reefs. As the boat's keel scraped against the stony beach, Shackleton jumped ashore. They had landed. Not far from where they stood, a small stream of fresh water trickled down from a glacier. All 6 men fell to their knees and drank. But they'd landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the opposite coast. Between them lay 29 miles of unmapped, impossible mountains and glaciers. No one had ever crossed South Georgia's interior. It was considered impassable. For Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, it was the only option. Leaving McNeish, Vincent, and McCarthy, too weak to continue, at the camp they named Peggotty Camp, the 3 men set out with only a 50-foot rope, a carpenter's adze, and 3 days' worth of food. For 36 hours they walked without stopping, without sleep. They climbed frozen slopes, navigated deadly crevasses, and fought through blinding fog. They weren't mountaineers. Their equipment was pathetic. Their boots had screws hammered into the soles for traction. At one point, high in the mountains as darkness fell and thick fog rolled in, they found themselves on a high ridge with a steep, snowy slope below. To stay meant freezing to death. To try climbing down in darkness was impossible. Shackleton made another audacious decision. They would slide. They coiled their rope to sit on, wrapped their arms around each other, and launched themselves into the darkness. They shot down the 2,000-foot slope in seconds, a terrifying, exhilarating plunge that saved them hours of dangerous climbing. After more than 30 hours of continuous struggle, utterly spent, they paused to rest. In the distance, through the thin morning air, they heard a sound, the 7 a.m. work whistle of the Stromness whaling station. It was the first sound of civilization they'd heard in 17 months. It was the sound of salvation. Hours later, 3 figures staggered into the whaling station. Their hair was long and matted, their faces blackened with blubber smoke, their clothes in tatters. The station foreman approached them. The man in the center spoke. "My name is Shackleton," he said quietly. They later heard that the old station manager, Thoralf Sorlow, wept. Shackleton's first thought was for his men. Within 3 days, he was back at sea on a whaler, heading for Elephant Island. But the Antarctic winter had arrived, and a wall of impenetrable pack ice blocked his way. He was forced to turn back. He tried again on a small trawler loaned by Uruguay. Again, the ice defeated him. A third attempt in a small schooner. Failure. For over 3 months, Shackleton was tormented by thoughts of the 22 men he'd left behind on that desolate beach with winter closing in. He'd promised them he'd return. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, Frank Wild held the party together. They'd overturned the 2 remaining boats to create a makeshift shelter they called the Snuggery. They lived in squalor, their days a monotonous routine of hunting, cooking, and waiting. Their hope, which had burned so brightly at first, began to flicker and die. As weeks turned into months, they secretly began to accept that the Kayard must have been lost. They started making plans to attempt their own escape in spring. On August 30th, 1916, 4.5 months after Shackleton sailed away, The men were inside the hut for their midday meal of boiled seal backbone. One of them, George Marston, had stepped outside. A moment later, he stuck his head back through the opening. "Wild," he said in a voice choked with emotion. "There's a ship." The hut erupted. Men scrambled out, tumbling over one another, tearing the door covering to shreds, and there it was, a small ship, steaming toward them. On the bridge, they could see a familiar, stocky figure. It was Shackleton. He'd made a fourth attempt, this time on a small Chilean tug called the Yelcho, and had finally found a break in the ice. As a boat was lowered, Shackleton shouted from the ship, "Are you all right?" A chorus of voices came back across the water, "All well." Within an hour, all 22 men were aboard the Yelcho, safe. Shackleton had kept his promise. He hadn't lost a single man. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition had failed in its original goal. They never set foot on the continent they'd set out to cross. But they'd achieved something far greater. They'd completed a journey of 1,700 miles of drifting on ice and sailing on the sea, and in doing so had written one of history's most inspiring chapters on leadership, loyalty, and the incredible, unconquerable endurance of the human spirit. So what do we take away from a story like this? It's tempting to see the voyage of the Endurance as just a spectacular adventure, a thrilling tale of survival against impossible odds. And it certainly is that. But I believe its power, the reason it's captivated people for over a century, lies in the deeper truths it reveals about leadership and human nature. The first, and perhaps most crucial lesson, is Shackleton's philosophy of leadership. His famous quote, which I mentioned earlier, deserves repeating. It was spoken by one of his contemporaries. "For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." Why? Because Shackleton's genius wasn't in planning or scientific discovery. His genius was in managing people. He understood that in crisis, a leader's primary responsibility is to nurture and protect the one resource that can't be loaded on a sledge: hope. He saw optimism not as a feeling but as a moral duty. Even in his darkest moments, when privately filled with doubt, he projected unshakable confidence to his men. He knew they were watching him, and if he faltered, they would all be lost. Think about that in your own life. When you're part of a team, whether it's a sports team, a school project, or a family, the emotional temperature is often set by the leader. A leader who remains calm and optimistic in the face of adversity gives everyone else permission and strength to do the same. The second powerful lesson is about redefining success. By any conventional measure, the expedition was a total failure. The grand objective was never achieved. But when the original goal became impossible, Shackleton immediately defined a new one: bring every single man home alive. This new mission became his singular obsession. Every decision he made, from abandoning the march, to sacrificing the dogs, to undertaking the perilous voyage of the James Caird, served that one goal. This is a profound lesson for all of us. We often get so fixated on our original plan that we see any deviation as failure. But life rarely goes according to plan. True success is often found in our ability to adapt, to release the old goal, and define a new, more meaningful one in the face of changing circumstances. Shackleton's story teaches us that sometimes the greatest victories are born from the ashes of our greatest failures. And finally, this is a story about the quiet, unglamorous nature of endurance. The survival of these men wasn't the result of one heroic act. It was the sum of thousands of small, difficult, and often monotonous acts of courage and discipline. It was the courage to get out of a wet sleeping bag into freezing cold, day after day. It was the discipline to stand watch in a howling blizzard. It was the loyalty to share a last biscuit with a comrade. Endurance, as this story reveals, isn't about grand gestures. It's about putting one foot in front of the other, especially when every part of you wants to give up. It's about finding strength to do the next right thing, and then the next, and the next. So what can you do with this? First, the next time you face a seemingly impossible challenge, remember Shackleton. Remember that optimism is both a choice and a tool. Second, think about your own goals. Are you flexible enough to redefine success if your original plan fails? And third, appreciate the power of small, consistent actions. True endurance is built not in moments of crisis, but in the daily habits of discipline and perseverance. That was the story of Endurance by Alfred Lansing. We've journeyed through the main events today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only scratch the surface of a story this immense. The real magic happens when you read the book yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when you read a direct entry from a man's diary, and feel the chill of his despair, or the warmth of his hope. This summary is designed to give you a glimpse into that world, to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take for yourself. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about courage, leadership, and the limits of what's possible. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and the story as moving as I do, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know these journeys matter and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep growing together.